This is just one of the many protests that occurred in Milwaukee, Wisconsin during the mid-20th century against segregation in public schooling. These occurred even after slavery and segregation were abolished. Through courage and perseverance, the disadvantaged minorities of Milwaukee would fight this major conflict in hopes of coming to a compromise, preventing their unequal opportunity at a decent education. Throughout history, African Americans have frequently been discriminated against, even in America, a country claiming to be free and to offer equality for all races and religions. This has caused a major conflict for many races and has prompted a fight for compromise and equality education. Milwaukee, Wisconsin, named America's most segregated major city according to WITI News, has historically been known to have incredibly segregated public schools. Even as segregation has been outlawed, the conflict is still very prominent. However, many brave people throughout Milwaukee have come forward to put up a fight for equality in hope of coming to a compromise and equal education for all students, no matter their skin color, ethnicity, or religion.
After slavery was eliminated in 1865, many Americans still believed that they were superior over African Americans. Throughout the 1950s, segregation, a new way to demean the African Americans, looked as though it would never end. Many African Americans seeking freedom fled to the North in hope of finding a home where all races were accepted and treated with equality. In the 1960s, there was a large influx of African Americans gathering in Milwaukee. Even though in the North segregation was frowned upon, it was still very prevalent. Housing, public areas, and schooling were segregated. The fight for integration started in the 1900s and has been an area of great conflict ever since. Throughout the United States, court cases were being opened, fighting for equal rights to education. Finally, on June 17, 1965, the Amos et al. Versus Board of School Directors of the City of Milwaukee case was presented, and the outcome of this one case changed Milwaukee schooling forever. Throughout the 1900s, the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction used forms of standardized testing to determine the amounts of students who could be identified as having high potential or who were mentally gifted. The number of students who were mentally gifted was significantly higher if you take only students who were white. Many students of color who were capable of having highly successful careers were unable to achieve their potential due to the poor teaching and discrimination throughout their school districts. As these schools began to become overcrowded, the board adopted a system known as intact busing. This practice began in the early 1950s and was built on the very foundations of segregation. Intact busing took whole classes, including the teachers, to less crowded schools. The students would go to classes in their normal schools in the morning, and then would be bused to different schools in the afternoon. The classes would be put together instead of mixing them in with other students from the school. All students were bused intact, but an outstanding majority of those were students of color. This is what caused influential people to get involved in the fight for equality in Milwaukee public schooling.
The large differences in test scores and school racial censuses began to attract national recognition, and many people began to take action. In one of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s trips to Milwaukee, The subject of his speech was the lack of diversity throughout Milwaukee as a whole and their school system. King reiterated the fact that he and his counterparts were not satisfied with the level of respect that they were receiving and would fight for their equality.
The disappointment, the frustration, the discontent, and the seething desperation within the Negro community happened to be very real.
Dick Gregory, a popular African-American comedian, also fought back alongside both King and many other highly influential people. One of the many events organized was a large boycott on March 1st of 1964, in which Gregory was quoted saying, "What we do here will help in Chicago, and from one end of the country to the other, and all over the world. The great thing about this is not black against white, it is right against wrong." During these large boycotts, the participants stood outside 12 Milwaukee public schools and 26 churches and community centers with pickets and Freedom School signs. Milwaukee United School Integration Committee, otherwise known as MUSIC, was an organization founded by Marilyn Moorhazer and Lloyd Barbie that fought for African Americans' rights and organized events in hope of gaining the respect they deserved. This organization held many protests throughout the year with the help of Gregory. Lloyd Barbie decided that just marching wasn't enough, so he began brainstorming solutions. He came to realize that everything the board of directors stood for was unconstitutional. He became the lawyer in a case that was designed to push Milwaukee for equal educational rights.
After the case was assigned, the board claimed that the segregation of the schools was due to the fact that the neighborhoods were mainly African American or mainly white. Although some of the school segregation was the result of neighborhood segregation, some of it came from intact busing. The school board tried to use this to alleviate the problem of overcrowding, but ultimately failed and caused segregation to subsequently worsen. Barbie thought that only allowing students to go to their neighborhood school and how the board was trying to keep that intact was an infraction of the Constitution. Federal Judge John Reynolds decided that he, quote, concluded that segregation exists in the Milwaukee public schools and that this segregation was intentionally created and maintained by the defendants, unquote. The board refused to put a plan for integration into action. The case then made its way to the Supreme Court, where Judge Reynolds' ruling was confirmed and a plan for integration of the schools was formed.
Unfortunately, segregation has not been completely obliterated, and many African American students still persevere through intense struggles when fighting for rights. Even when the case was newly closed, the plan to integrate was flawed. According to the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, quote, the racial integration plan that was implemented over several years was largely focused on trying to make a group of magnet schools attractive enough that both white and black children would enroll, unquote. These magnet schools help bring more integration into Milwaukee, but some people forget that schools that were not considered magnet schools are still extremely segregated. The students that go to these schools have been forgotten, and this has caused great strife for them. The brave advocates for African Americans in Milwaukee are still fighting this major conflict in hopes of finding a compromise for total racial integration throughout the public school system. Seeing how far we have come has encouraged these courageous individuals to keep fighting for African American youth. When people in the future look back at this conflict, they will see many amazing individuals who hope to bring more compromises and even better education for all students.